The gymnasium smelled like hot glue and cut flowers, and I was on my knees fixing a paper petal that had come loose from Lucia's fundraiser board when I felt someone watching me from across the room. Not Dante. Someone else. A woman in a gray blazer with a notepad she kept angled so no one could read it, and she wasn't looking at the silent auction table. She was looking at him. 6 months into this job, and I still noticed things like that before I noticed almost anything else. Old habit. Useful one, it turned out. Lucia tugged my sleeve and told me the flower looked like a real one now, and for a second that was the whole world, a 5-year-old proud of pressed petals under laminate, and I let myself have it. She hadn't needed the hallway light in 11 nights. I kept a tally in my head like it was something I'd earned instead of something I'd only witnessed. Dante stood near the punch table the way he always stood near me, which is to say exactly 2 feet farther away than a person needed to be for casual conversation. I used to think it was coldness. By month 3, I understood it was the opposite. A man who ran a house like that one didn't accidentally maintain that kind of distance. He built it, brick by careful brick, and never once let it slip, which told me more about how much control he had than anything he could have said out loud. He caught my eye once across the gym and gave me the smallest nod, the kind he reserved for when Lucia had done something he was quietly proud of, and I realized after a second he meant the flower board, not me, and felt a small, foolish disappointment at that before I told myself firmly to stop being ridiculous. He was my employer. I repeated that to myself the way you repeat a fact you're starting to doubt. I didn't see Marcus until his hand was already on my wrist. He didn't shout. That was the thing people never understood about him, the thing I used to mistake for gentleness. He leaned in close, smiling like we were old friends catching up, and said I still owed him for the lease neither of us had ever untangled. And wasn't it funny, running into me here, of all places, working for a man like this? My pulse did the thing it used to do every day for 2 years, and I hated my own body for remembering the pattern so fast. If you've ever felt an old fear grab you by the wrist before the person attached to it even finished a sentence, you already know exactly why I couldn't get a single word out, and that's exactly why I need you to stick around for what happens next, because it gets worse before it gets better. Across the room, the woman in the gray blazer had her pen moving again, faster now, and I understood with a cold drop in my stomach that she wasn't just watching Dante anymore. She was watching this, watching me, writing down exactly the kind of scene a lawyer could stand up in a courtroom and read out loud. Dante crossed that gymnasium in about 4 seconds, which should have been impossible given how far away he'd been standing on purpose all night. He didn't ask Marcus a question. He didn't raise his voice. He said one sentence, low enough that only the people closest to us could hear it clearly, and it wasn't tender, it wasn't romantic, and it landed in that room like something dropped from a height. "Get your hands off my wife." The words landed, and the whole gymnasium seemed to hold its breath around us. Somewhere behind me, a woman I recognized from the PDA committee stopped mid-sentence, her cup of punch frozen halfway to her mouth. A child laughed at something across the room, oblivious, and the sound seemed to come from very far away. Marcus's hand was still on my wrist, but it had gone slack like the bones in it had forgotten their job. Marcus's face went the color of the paper tablecloth. My own thoughts went white and silent. The exact kind of silence that comes right before you understand you've stepped into a version of your life you didn't agree to. The woman in the gray blazer lowered her pen very slowly. "Wife," she said, and her voice was perfectly even, the voice of someone who had learned a long time ago never to let surprise show on her face. "I don't have a marriage on file for you, Mr. Marchetti." I looked at Dante. Dante looked at me. And for the first time since I'd taken this job, I had absolutely no idea what either of us was supposed to say. Marcus left without another word, walking too fast toward the exit doors, the kind of fast that isn't quite running but wants to be. Miss Prather closed her notepad, said something polite and unreadable about the wonderful turnout, and left a few minutes later without asking either of us a single follow-up question, which somehow felt worse than if she had. The drive home was 14 minutes of a silence, so complete I could hear Lucia's breathing from her booster seat. Slow and even, blessedly asleep, blessedly unaware that her father had just told a stranger I was his wife in front of the one person in the world whose job it was to decide whether he got to keep her. Dante didn't explain anything until she was tucked in and the hallway light was off, exactly the way she needed it now. And then he stood in his own kitchen and told me, in short, clipped sentences, the parts of his life I'd been paid very well not to ask about. It was a custody case. There had been one for 8 months, quietly, expensively, and I had somehow worked in that house for half a year without ever hearing Renata's name spoken once. Renata was Lucia's mother. Renata had gotten clean, and a judge was going to like that a great deal, and Renata's lawyer had already built half a case out of one simple, damning sentence. Unmarried father, live-in nanny, no maternal figure in the home. He hadn't planned what he said in that gymnasium. He told me that plainly, like a man giving testimony rather than an apology. He'd looked at Prather's pen moving and understood, in less than a second, exactly what that scene would become in a filing, and he'd reached for the fastest thing that could change the story being written in real time. He offered me a way out that wasn't really an apology either. It was a proposal, if you could call it that, laid out the way you'd lay out a business contract. A real license. A real signature. A temporary marriage with a built-in exit door once the case was settled, and enough money that I'd never have to think about Marcus's lease again. He said all of it standing on the far side of the kitchen island, both hands flat on the counter, like he needed something solid to hold on to while he asked. I noticed that. I noticed the distance he kept even now, when it would have been so easy to close it, and something about that restraint told me more than the offer itself did. I want you to know that my hesitation in that kitchen had almost nothing to do with Dante. It had to do with the fact that a man had just decided who I was to a room full of strangers, and some old, cold part of me recognized the shape of that, even when the intention behind it was protection instead of control. I'd spent 2 years with someone who decided things about me and called it love. I wasn't going to spend even one more week not knowing the difference. So I asked myself, right there in his kitchen, a question I hadn't gotten to ask in a very long time. Not whether I could survive this, whether I wanted it on my own terms. I thought about the apartment I'd left behind, the one with Marcus's name still on half the utility bills, because untangling a lie from someone like him takes longer than leaving the room does. I thought about 11 nights without a hallway light. I thought about how strange it was that the safest offer I'd been given in years had come wrapped in a lie told in front of a stranger with a notepad. Tell me honestly in the comments if you'd have said yes right there on the spot, or made him ask you properly first, because I did neither, and what I actually did surprised both of us. I told him my conditions instead. Separate rooms. A real end date, written down, not implied. And Marcus was never, under any circumstances, to come near Lucia, ever, for any reason. Dante agreed before I'd even finished the sentence, and something in his face shifted when I laid the terms out myself, instead of simply accepting his. Relief, maybe, or respect. I couldn't tell yet, and it would be a while before I could. The notary who came to the house 4 days later stamped a license that would make me, on paper, Mrs. Marchetti by the end of the week. Not for love. For a 5-year-old asleep upstairs who had no idea any of this was happening, and a version of stability that existed entirely in legal documents and nowhere in my actual heart. Not yet, anyway. I signed my name and had absolutely no idea how I was going to explain any of it to Lucia in the morning. The emergency motion landed 9 days later, faster than any of Dante's lawyers expected, which should have told us something right then about how fast information was moving out of that house. Renata's lawyer called it a sham marriage entered into during active litigation, and Dante's own attorney told him flatly that this was worse than no marriage at all, because now it read like manipulation aimed directly at the court instead of a stable home built in good faith. That week I met Isabella properly for the first time, though I'd seen her in photographs around the house before. She was Dante's late brother's wife, and she'd run the household affairs since before I arrived, and she folded me into her orbit with a warmth that felt, at the time, like the first real kindness anyone in that family had offered me without a contract attached. She taught me things. What to wear if Prather asked to see the house again. How to answer if someone asked how Dante and I met in a way that sounded true, because most of it was. She asked, more than once, exactly how the vows had been worded, and exactly which courthouse had filed the license. And I remember thinking at the time that it was simply thoroughness. A woman who liked details. I had no reason yet to think of it any other way. She made tea the old way, loose leaves, and a strainer she'd brought with her from Sicily decades ago. And she'd sit across from me at the kitchen table running through the same questions 2 or 3 different ways, always gently, always sounding like a woman preparing me to survive something rather than a woman gathering something for herself. I liked her. I want that understood clearly, because it matters later. I genuinely liked her. Late one night, after Lucia's homework had been abandoned half-finished on the kitchen table, Dante and I had the first conversation between us that wasn't about optics or strategy at all. He told me, without any performance in his voice, that Renata wasn't the villain in this story, just someone he no longer trusted with the daily, unglamorous safety of a small child. He said it carefully, like it cost him something to be fair to her. That admission complicated something in me I hadn't examined yet. The assumption that this whole situation was a simple story of a good parent and a bad one. It wasn't. And somehow that made me care about the outcome more, not less. He told me about the early years too, when Renata was still using and he was still trying to convince himself it would pass, the way people do when they love someone and don't yet understand that love isn't the same thing as a cure. He didn't tell it for sympathy. He told it because I'd asked, and because by then he seemed to trust me with things he hadn't handed to anyone else in that house, not even Isabella. I asked him once, carefully, why he'd never simply told the court the truth from the beginning, that he was unmarried and doing his best, instead of building a case around optics. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered. He said the truth had never once been enough to keep this family safe, not from rival business, not from grief, not from a court that measured fitness in checkboxes instead of love. So he'd stopped trusting it to do the job alone. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't know if I do. If you like a hero who's willing to say the other side of his own story isn't evil, just wrong for this particular moment, hit that like button right now, before the lawyers show back up, because they're about to. The court set a hearing date and ordered a home visit from Prather within the week, and when the clerk read the date out loud, I watched Dante's jaw tighten in a way I hadn't seen since the gymnasium. Marcus found me again 11 days after that, and this time he didn't grab my wrist. He'd done his research instead, which was somehow worse. He knew about the marriage. He knew about the timing. He texted me directly, not Dante, dressing the whole thing up as a favor between old friends, offering to forget the debt and stay quiet about how conveniently timed our wedding looked to a tabloid, if I wired him a specific amount by the end of the month. I recognized the shape of it immediately, and that recognition hurt almost more than the threat itself. 2 years with him had taught me exactly what coercion sounds like when it's wearing a friendly voice, and some small, exhausted part of me had hoped I'd never have to identify that sound again. I didn't tell Dante right away. I wanted, badly, to handle this one thing myself, as proof to no one but me that I wasn't the fragile person Marcus had spent 2 years convincing me I was. I called a lawyer friend from my old life instead, someone I hadn't spoken to since before Marcus, and she picked up on the second ring like no time had passed at all. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, then told me his claim on that lease was shaky at best, unenforceable at worst, built on nothing but the hope that I'd still flinch the way I used to. I didn't flinch. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I texted Marcus back a flat, unambiguous no, and then I set my phone face down on the counter and made myself a cup of tea with hands that were only shaking a little. If you've ever had a friend who told you that you don't owe an ex anything, send this to them right now, because Elena was about to prove them completely right. Refused, Marcus did what people like him always do when a direct approach fails. He found an indirect one, somewhere in an inbox I'd never see. An editor read a tip about a Mafia boss's rushed courthouse wedding and wrote back 4 words that would blow the next month of my life apart. This one's real. Assign it today. We didn't know that yet. That week, we had a good day instead, an ordinary one, assembling a school diorama with Lucia at the kitchen table, glue and glitter, and Dante's ridiculous seriousness about getting the tiny paper trees to stand up straight. He held one crooked pine between 2 fingers for a full minute, frowning at it like it had personally wronged him, and Lucia laughed so hard at his face that she knocked over the glitter jar, and none of us cared. Nothing about that hour had anything to do with danger. I want to be clear about that, because it mattered to me later how much of what grew between us grew in rooms with no threat in them at all. I caught him watching me across the table once, not the careful, measuring look he used in front of other people, but something looser, something that looked almost like surprise at his own house being this ordinary and this warm. Prather's home visit arrived on a gray Tuesday, and the whole day felt like performing a play we'd only half rehearsed while somehow also, quietly, living it. Dante made coffee the way I liked it without being asked, which shouldn't have meant anything except that he'd clearly noticed at some point without ever mentioning it. I caught myself laughing at something he said before I remembered I was supposed to be performing ease instead of feeling it. Somewhere in the space between the performance and the truth, I lost track of which one I was actually doing. Prather walked the house slowly, asking small questions in a tone that gave nothing away. She crouched down to Lucia's level in the playroom and asked her what her favorite part of the day was, and Lucia, without a flicker of hesitation, said dinner, because that was when Daddy told the worst jokes on purpose. Prather wrote that down too, and for a moment I let myself believe the day was going well. Isabella was there too, helping, she said, and at one point she steered one of Prather's questions gently toward the exact date the marriage license had been filed. It seemed protective in the moment. Prather wrote the date down with a little more interest than I expected, and I filed that detail away without understanding yet why it mattered. Prather is about to ask one question in this house that changes everything about how this visit goes. So don't skip ahead because you're going to want the whole moment when it comes. It came in her car, in our driveway, before she'd even finished her paperwork. Marcus's story had gone live online, and I watched Prather's face change as she read the headline on her phone, watched the whole visit shift in real time from cautiously warm to carefully guarded. Dante did something that I hadn't seen him do once in 6 months. Instead of managing what Prather thought of him, he told her the truth. The marriage had started as protection, he said, and it had stopped being only that. I heard it from the hallway. I wasn't supposed to be there. I'd gone to get Lucia's shoes and frozen halfway down the hall instead. And I stood there long enough to hear a man who never said more than he had to say something he clearly hadn't planned to say out loud, in front of a stranger with a notepad, no less. He didn't know I heard him. He turned around a moment later and found me already standing in the doorway. And something passed between us in that half second that neither of us had a script for anymore. Prather left without giving a clear recommendation either way, and I stood frozen in that hallway a long time after her car pulled out of the driveway, holding a secret that belonged to both of us now, whether he knew it yet or not. We didn't rush toward each other after that. I want you to know that too, because I think it says something true about what was actually happening between us. A few nights later, we sat on the back steps after Lucia was asleep and had the first conversation either of us had allowed ourselves that wasn't strategy, wasn't optics, wasn't survival. Just two people admitting things slowly with no danger anywhere in the room to blame it on. It didn't last long before the world came back in. Reporters had started camping near Lucia's school. And worse, a business partner Dante had worked with for years quietly pulled out a shipping contract, citing, in careful corporate language, a need for clarity on the Marchetti family's stability. Not a threat with a face this time. A threat made of headlines and withdrawn signatures. This is the part of the story where the danger stops being about hands grabbing wrists and starts being about what gets printed. So subscribe now if you want to see exactly how they fight back against something you can't punch. Dante's phone hadn't stopped ringing since sunrise. Business partners asking careful, deniable questions. A reporter who'd somehow gotten his private number. He handled every call the same way, calm and clipped, but I watched the muscle in his jaw work through each one, and I understood that this kind of threat cost him something different than a fist would have. There was no one to stand between him and it. I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of hiding from the reporters camped outside the school, I walked straight toward them, and I gave a short, steady statement about a private family being harassed rather than a scandal unfolding, and I watched something shift in how Dante looked at me afterward. Not gratitude. Respect. The difference mattered more than I expected it to. Dante found me in the hallway afterward and didn't say anything at all for a moment, just looked at me the way you look at someone you're recalculating. Then he said it had taken him years to learn how to stand in front of camera without flinching, and I'd just done it in one afternoon, and I told him it hadn't felt brave, it had just felt necessary, which is usually how bravery actually feels from the inside. Isabella praised the moment almost too warmly and asked, more than once, exactly what I'd told the reporters, word for word, and I answered her without thinking twice about it, because why would I have? She squeezed my hand afterward and told me I'd done well, and I remember feeling, briefly, like I'd earned a place in that family that had nothing to do with a courthouse license at all. A reporter shouted one more question at my back as I turned to leave the school steps. Is it true the marriage license was backdated? I froze completely because I had absolutely no idea where a detail that specific could possibly have come from. The hearing began on a Thursday morning in a courtroom that smelled like carpet cleaner and old paper, and Renata was there, and I want to tell you honestly that she did not look like a villain. She looked like a woman fighting hard for her daughter, sober and frightened and doing her best, and some complicated part of my chest ached for her even as I sat on the other side of the room from her. Her lawyer produced the backdating allegation formally, with filing details specific enough that only someone inside our household could plausibly have known them. And I watched Dante's face go very still, the stillness of a man doing math he didn't like the answer to. If you already have a guess about who's been feeding information to the other side, drop in the comments right now, before the reveal, because I promise you it isn't who you think. They asked me to testify, and nobody had coached me on what to say, so I said true things instead. Small things. The specific way Lucia liked her toast cut into triangles, not squares, or she'd refuse the whole plate. The 3 books she needed read in the exact same order every single night, or she couldn't fall asleep, and how she'd started tucking the 3rd one, the one about a lonely little fox, under her own pillow like it was something precious she didn't want anyone else touching. My voice shook for the first sentence, and then steadied, because I wasn't performing anything. I wasn't trying to win a judge over. I was just telling the truth about a child I'd come, somewhere in the last 6 months, to love without meaning to. It wasn't glamorous testimony. It was the most convincing thing anyone said in that courtroom all day, precisely because it wasn't performed. I watched Dante's hand unclench on the table while I spoke. It was the first time since I'd known him that he looked like a man who wasn't bracing for an attack. Renata's lawyer pressed harder in cross-examination, asking me directly how much I was being paid to say all of this, and I felt the old flinch rise in my throat before I made myself answer plainly. I told her the truth, that yes, there had been an arrangement once, with an exit clause and a fixed date, and that somewhere in the last few months I'd stopped thinking about either one. The courtroom went very quiet after that. I don't know if it helped our case. I know it helped me. The judge didn't rule that day. He ordered a forensic review of the marriage filing instead, to settle the backdating question once and for all, and gave us 48 hours. As we walked out of the courthouse, Marcus was standing by Dante's car. He looked different than he had at the fundraiser. Thinner, desperate in a way that made him more dangerous, not less, because he had nothing left to lose, and he knew it. His tabloid payout had fallen through when the story got buried under bigger news, and his legal claim on the lease had collapsed the week before under his own lawyer's advice to drop it. He reached for me first. Then, when I pulled back, he reached for Lucia's hand instead, not to hurt her, but to make it very clear he could, and that single gesture did something to the air around us that I will never fully be able to describe. The next 60 seconds are exactly why this story got recommended to you in the first place. So stay through this part because it moves fast. Dante didn't explode. That was the thing that surprised me most, watching him in that parking lot. 6 months earlier, in a gymnasium, his response to danger had been one furious sentence claiming me as his. This time, faced with something far worse, he was quiet, decisive, and terrifyingly calm, already moving Lucia behind him with one hand while security came running from the courthouse steps. I got Lucia fully clear myself, into the back seat of the car, doors locked before anyone in a uniform even reached us. I want that on the record because it mattered to me. I wasn't rescued in that parking lot. I acted. Marcus was arrested on the spot, and just like that, 6 years of my life walked away in the back of a patrol car and never came back into this story again. I stood by the car afterward, watching the flashing lights bounce off the courthouse windows, and I felt something in my chest loosen that I hadn't even known was still clenched. Back at the house that night, shaking in the kitchen with a cup of tea neither of us drank, Dante and I had our first fully unguarded moment, the kind that had been building quietly for weeks in ordinary rooms and finally had nowhere left to hide. I won't pretend it came out of nowhere. It didn't. It came out of 6 months of small, undramatic things, finally given room to breathe. After everything that's happened, comment your honest theory below. Is this marriage still fake at this point? Or are we long past pretending it ever was? At midnight, a courier arrived with the forensic report on the filing. I heard the knock from upstairs. By the time I got to the top of the stairs, Isabella was already at the door, and she took the envelope from the courier's hands before Dante had even come out of the kitchen. Dante read the report standing in the kitchen doorway, and I watched his face change twice. First relief when he reached the line clearing the license. Then something much harder when he reached the next page. The report cleared the license itself completely. Every signature, every date, entirely legitimate. But it traced the source of the backdating rumor to a single phone call placed to Renata's lawyer's office from a number registered to Isabella. She didn't deny it when Dante confronted her, and she didn't apologize either. She stood in that kitchen with her chin level and told him, plainly, that she believed his closeness to the business, the part of it he never spoke of in front of Lucia, endangered his daughter far more than anything in Renata's past ever had. She said losing this case might be the only thing that finally forced him out of that life for good, and she'd leaked the rumor believing, in her own hard, complicated way, that she was protecting Lucia by a harder road than any of us had considered. Betrayal with an actual reason behind it hits differently than the usual kind. So send this to someone who loves a twist that isn't just cruelty for its own sake, because Isabella never once acted like a villain in her own story. It reframed everything. Her questions about the vows, about the filing date, about exactly what I'd said to the reporters. None of it had ever been aimed at me. It had been aimed at protecting a 5-year-old, the only way Isabella knew how to fight for her. She told us, standing very straight in that kitchen like a woman giving a final statement rather than a confession, that she'd buried a husband who'd died because of the business Dante still hadn't fully let go of. And she would not bury a niece to it too, not while there was still a lever left to pull. Her voice didn't shake once. I think that was the part that stayed with me longest, how calm she was about something so drastic. She hadn't acted out of panic. She'd acted out of years of quiet, accumulated fear, finally spent on the one plan she thought might actually work. Dante had a choice now that had nothing to do with courts or reporters. Prosecute the woman who'd helped raise him since his brother died, or find another way through this that didn't require destroying her to save himself. I didn't tell him what to choose. I only pointed out the option none of us had considered yet. Full honesty with the court about all of it, including his own willingness to actually change instead of concealment or punishment. He told his lawyer the next morning to withdraw the prepared defense. He was going to tell the judge the truth himself. All of it. Isabella didn't come to the reconvened hearing. She sent word instead that she'd accept whatever consequence Dante decided on, and that she'd meant every word she said in that kitchen, and that she was sorry for the method, not the reason. Dante read her note twice before folding it into his jacket pocket and walking into the courtroom. The hearing reconvened 3 days later, and Dante testified to every piece of it without flinching. The marriage had begun as a legal maneuver in a gymnasium. Isabella had leaked a rumor out of love twisted sideways into fear. And he had already begun, weeks earlier, moving the legitimate parts of his shipping business into a structure with no shadows left in it, not as a single dramatic gesture for the judge's benefit, but as something already underway before anyone asked him to prove it. The judge wasn't moved by the legal cleanup nearly as much as he was moved by testimony from Lucia's teacher and her pediatrician, independent of anything I said, describing a stable, well-loved little girl who thrived in that house. He granted Dante primary custody, with a generous, structured visitation arrangement for Renata, who left that courtroom with her daughter still very much a part of her life, not erased from it. I was glad of that. I think in the end, Dante was too. Renata caught my eye on her way out of the courtroom, and instead of the resentment I half expected, she gave me a small, tired nod, the kind one exhausted person gives another. Later I found out she'd told her own lawyer she didn't want to fight past this point, that watching her daughter's teacher describe a happy child had told her everything she actually needed to know. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. It was something quieter and more honest than that, and I think it suited all of us better. As for Isabella, Dante didn't press charges. He gave her a choice instead, a formal step back from the household's finances while she kept every other part her place in Lucia's life, and she took it without argument, relieved, I think, to finally not be the one holding everything together alone. A custody ending that doesn't erase the other parent from the picture entirely is rare in stories like this one. So if you appreciated that choice, let me know with a like right now. Afterward, in the quiet that comes after a fight finally ends, Dante and I faced the only question left that actually belonged to us. The case was over. The legal reason for the marriage no longer existed. He didn't propose to me, not the way you'd expect, not a mirror of that furious sentence in the gymnasium. He asked me instead what I wanted the marriage to be, and handed the decision back to me a second time, the same way he had in his kitchen months earlier, when he let me name my own terms instead of simply accepting his. I chose to stay, not because anyone rescued me, not because I owed it to Lucia, though I loved her enough that I would have found a way regardless. I chose it because for the first time in longer than I could remember, the choice was actually mine to make, and I made it with my eyes open. We refiled the paperwork 2 weeks later, both signatures given freely this time, Lucia asleep upstairs the whole while, no lawyer, no investigator, no urgency in the room at all. The kitchen was quiet. The same kitchen where he'd first laid out the terms of a deal, where I'd named my own conditions and meant them, where he'd told a stranger a truth he hadn't planned to say out loud. It felt right that it ended there too. I signed my name under the word wife for the second time in my life, and this time, nobody had to tell me to. If this is the kind of ending you needed tonight, one where the choice finally belongs to her, hit subscribe and stay close, because the next story I'm bringing you starts with a woman who wasn't nearly as lucky as I was, and you're not going to want to miss how she gets herself out.